News Talk ZB News.
It's 5 o'clock. I'm Raylene Ramsey. The government's backing its introduction mandatory testing for staff at managed isolation and quarantine. A maintenance worker at Auckland's Ridges Hotel has tested positive for Covid-19. Despite working at the managed isolation facility, he had no obvious contact with returnees. But genome sequencing links him to an infected person who flew in. Housing Minister Megan Woods says the most important way to keep facilities COVID-free is to wear appropriate PPE and test all staff, even if asymptomatic.
At the facility where this has taken place, there is 100% of all staff have been tested, and across the network in Auckland, it's 97% of all staff within MIQ have been tested.
So are you not testing all border staff with a swab every week?
No, that would be unnecessary. There are thousands of people that work at the port and at the airport, and we don't need to test them every week. We will be doing very regular tests. Later this week, I'll sign the board a new order which sets out the testing regime once this current sweep of testing is done. So the sweep is covering absolutely everybody. The order that I'll sign later in the week will set up a regime that makes it mandatory in certain circumstances. And the key focus there will be on people who are most at risk. So people who are working on the air side of the border at the airport, for example, coming into contact with people getting on and off planes, they're higher risk, so there'll be a very stringent, regular testing regime for them. Those who are working on the New Zealand side of the border who aren't coming into contact with people who are getting off planes, well, obviously, the risk there is lower, and so the testing probably doesn't need to be as frequent. But anyone showing symptoms, of course, will get an immediate test.
Swab.
That's right, a swab.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Air New Zealand international crew, and in fact all international crew coming into the country, are they getting tested, all of them, when they get home?
Look, there are criteria that are in place there. The focus has been on high-risk countries. I'm actually reviewing that as we speak at the moment, and there'll be a new order. I'll be issuing an order again on that one this week that will set out very clearly the criteria for the testing. Those who are coming from high-risk countries, the air crew coming from high-risk countries, do have to isolate. They do have to have a negative test before they're allowed out into the community. One of the things that I think is becoming very apparent is that there are very few places around the world that don't have risk associated with them. So I'll be looking very closely at what we regard, what's previously been viewed as low risk, because I actually think that we need to question the very notion of whether we can call anyone coming in from offshore low risk.
Let's just understand, Minister, because my impression from watching your 1 o'clock briefing was that every single one of those international air crew coming into the country would be tested. Is that not the case?
Ultimately, the airlines have testing in place. They'll be testing anyone who's asymptomatic. They have to test people who are coming from higher risk countries. And very shortly, we'll be setting out the mandatory requirements that we're putting in place there. And it will be part of an order. It will be a legal requirement.
In that order, will you require that every single one of them gets tests before they go into the community?
So I'm working through that at the moment. Obviously, I'm talking to the airlines because one of the things they have to do is work out.
That's what you said at 1 o'clock, isn't it?
I've got to work out the practical constraints.
Have you had resistance from the airline?
Reasons. I've had some conversations with the airlines. I mean, there are some practical things in here around how long you ask them to isolate for, how long how regularly they have to be tested, the circumstances under which they're tested. So I'm working through all of that with them, with the airlines and with the health officials. Look, I'm not saying that they've got a problem with it, but
somebody's got a problem with it, Minister. Somebody's obviously got a problem with it because you said at 1 o'clock that every single one of them is going to get tested, and now you're saying that's not going to happen.
Look, there are some logistical issues that we're working our way through. And I will, as I've said here, I'll be issuing an order this week that will make it absolutely clear what the testing regime is for those air crew.
What are those logistical issues?
Look, like I said, I'm working through those at the moment. That includes, we don't want to create an environment where anyone working on an international air crew can never come home because,
Minister, let me just ask you something. How can you stand there at the 1 o'clock press conference that you have told everybody to tune into because this is the podium of fact and truth, and then you go and say something like that and we're talking to you 4 hours later and the whole story has changed? What's going on here?
Look, like I said, there will be an order that I'll be issuing this week that will make it very, very clear in the future what the future testing regime will be.
What's changed? How can you do this? Are you guys not doing enough homework before you get up there and you say what you're going to do?
No, I think you're misinterpreting my statements.
I don't think I am.
But you know, there's a lot of complexity here around the testing regime for aircrew. A lot of different things that you need to work your way through. Bearing in mind that some will be at higher risk than others. The biggest risk is not actually those when they're on the plane, because they're wearing PPE when they're on the plane and they're putting a lot of protective measures in place. There'll be a higher risk if they're having a layover somewhere, you know, meaning if they're stopping and staying overnight in another country. So all of those things, we've got to understand the risk. We've got to understand all of the potential areas where things could go wrong and make sure we're mitigating all of those. It's not just, but just let's be clear here. It's not just about testing. Testing's not the only thing we have to do here. Ultimately, the goal is for every test we do to come back negative, because we've got, you know, sufficient protection in place in the first place to stop someone getting it.
That's just not going to happen, is it? Minister, listen, I'm just going to take you back to something that you said. I have a quote here saying, on Saturday, the Minister of Health, Chris Hipkins, said he was disappointed to learn that all staff were not being tested weekly at the border. You say that's frustrating, and you took responsibility for your part in the situation and made it compulsory for all border staff to be tested weekly. Is that not true?
Yes.
All border staff will be tested weekly? Or all front-facing border staff will be tested
weekly? That's right, all front-facing border. How
many staff is that?
That's a couple of hundred. It's not a huge number if we're talking about it.
Let's just be clear, out of 2,980 border staff.
That's right. Okay. But, you know, if we're talking about the people who are front-facing, they meet people coming off the planes, and they're at that point in the process where they'll, you know, come into contact with people coming off planes. It is a couple of hundred people.
Maintenance workers, are they front-facing?
No, they're not, and that's one of the things. That's one of the reasons why this case that we're dealing with at the moment. That's one of the reasons why this case that we're dealing with at the moment is very interesting, because he did not come into contact with anybody who had COVID-19 in that facility. So there's a lot of work going on to understand exactly how that happened.
All right, Minister, thanks very much. I wouldn't use the word interesting. I'd use the word extremely worrying. Well, that's 2 words, isn't it? 2 words. Chris Hipkins, thank you so much. Health Minister, 5:16, News Talk ZB.